The only area of the arts that Peter Ustinov did not try was painting. Not only did he excel in film, theatre, television and writing, he was also a wonderful raconteur and the dream interview for any journalist or broadcaster. He brought to the table a vast knowledge of the arts and the world, coming from a Russian, Armenian, German, Jewish and Ethiopian ancestry. I first interviewed him at the Cineasts Association in Montreal in 1966 when he was a guest of Roch Demer, who ran the Montreal Film Festival. Ustinov was amiable in the extreme, willing to do anything asked of him. The delight for me, though, was his freshness of thought. Regardless of how dull the question, Ustinov came up with original, thought-provoking answers. In his life he won awards and honours from around the world, but Peter Ustinov didn't need them. Nothing could add polish to a very special man.
Oh, well, it's very difficult to be a fan of something that you're engaged in, I find. I'm not a very great theatre goer, but I enjoy myself in the theatre. I'm very fond of music, so I go to concerts very often, but I can't play anything. So that's just one of those paradoxes. But I enjoy films if I'm taken.
If you're taken,
Yeah.
you mean?
If I'm propelled there. I find it very difficult to go very often because I just, I don't know, I write or I do something else.
I know you started in the theatre. Do you enjoy film work as much as you enjoy theatre work?
What's nice about the theatre is rehearsing. Well, that's the most interesting part. Once you've got in front of an audience, then it's liable, if it's good, to go on for some time, which is depressing, and if it's bad, not to go on for some time, which is even more depressing. So that really the cinema nowadays affords more variety. And it's very interesting, if you're acting, to build a role over several weeks. It's not as impossible as people imagine, even to do it in the wrong order. If you're directing, of course, the film is largely a communal effort. I've got myself in a hot water occasionally, and I have no hesitation of doing so again by saying that it's really not an art at all. It's a cocktail of artistic manifestations, which is made up of people who happen to be free at that moment. Because already if the great director tries to get one specific cameraman and he finds that man's busy and he has to engage another one, the final result is already slightly different. And the cameraman is, after all, at the moment, at the present state of technical evolution, is the only man who really sees it at the time, because he's the only one that is conscious of the frame, or really the operator, not even the cameraman. So that the film is very exciting, because it's a form of, I think, inspiring, and at its best, inspired journalism, because you're attracting a situation towards yourself, which is, after all, what the best journalists do. They tend to invent stories and then bring the truth towards it.
How successful was Billy Budd in your own estimation? I picked Billy Budd simply because you wrote it and you directed it and you acted in it, and apart from a couple of other roles. Now it's, 2-3 years after the event? How successful do you see it?
I should have been more depressed than I am, and I'm not depressed, really, if I hadn't done it. In fact, it was a thing I had to get out of my system, and I think it's the best film I made. Whether it's commercial or not is very difficult to say, because with a film like that, it is possible that it'll recoup its original investment, or maybe has already done so over the years, because it's consistently taken up again by small cinemas, and it's found its own champions, which gives me great pleasure. And I wrote in the Sunday Times in London that it enabled me, with the help of Melville, to fight my way through to my own heart, which is not always an easy thing to do. But it's a film I feel very strongly about still, and I think it's probably, of all the things I've done on a fairly large scale, it's the one in which the dream was most closely implemented by reality.
Which is quite something after the many things you've done. Because this one you feel so successful, would you embark on another wholesale marauding against the film again in the same capacities?
Well, of course, that film had a slightly mysterious quality to it in any case, because since all the action took place on board ship, and therefore the field for shooting was very limited, because you could never take the camera off the ship, or very, very rarely. Therefore, in some mysterious way, the job of playing the role of the captain of the ship and that of director became almost identical. and it was felt even by the actors. That eventually we got into a kind of stratosphere in which what happened on the ship became more real to us than what happened in the evening when we went home and ate our meals independently. I don't think that that's possible, of course, with the usual kind of story, because I really don't think it's possible to do a large-scale film in which one appears oneself. After all, you can't very well lead the charge of the Light Brigade and with a slight flick of the saber give an indication to the cameraman that he should be doing something else.
So you don't think you're going to go in for that capacities again? Director, writer, actor?
Oh, I may do, but you'd have to choose the story very carefully. And you have to watch very carefully also that one or the other of those activities doesn't suffer. In other words, you have to be surrounded by people, first of all, that are in sympathy with you, which I think is tremendously important in any case. And secondly, it doesn't do under those circumstances to be a dictator. What you really need is the casting vote.
You're known as a writer and performer. I suppose we can put your activities into those two categories. Which is most important to you, the writing or the performing?
I think the writing is more important because if it succeeds, it's after all more difficult. And if it succeeds, it's more of a miracle. Intrinsically, acting is easier. To put it at its lowest possible level, it's easier to give a bad performance than to write a bad play. To do either well is very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Do you know why you took the humorous route?
That's a question of temperament, I think. It's a question of an innate irony, and I think obviously I'm cynical enough to imagine that people's opinions are really formed by their capacities. A man that can't make people laugh will say that laughter is unimportant, and the man that has that particular gift on occasion will think that it's tremendously important. A man who sways the crowd talks the whole time about popular opinion, and the man that can't sway the crowd thinks that really the government should be in the hand of one man.
Mm-hmm. One university, and I forget which one, did a research project into laughter and came out with the fact that people with higher IQs had better senses of humor. Do you agree with this?
Yes, except that I don't like the word IQ because it suggests really exams and school. You can still get a very high sense of humor and a very advanced sense of humor in an extremely simple man that's looked after sheep all his life, if he happens not to have wasted his time while sitting on that hillside. It comes back, I think, to a question of creating your own world and seeing seeing reality through the lens which your own imagination has supplied. The people who belong to what one might call middle class or a bourgeois society, and I'm not using these statements just as political ones, I don't mean that at all, but I mean the people that are shocked if you suddenly enter the room in a red tie when everybody else is in a black tie. Those are people who have accepted the world that's been given them, and therefore, however intelligent they are at their work in various spheres, I wouldn't call their IQ terribly high. They probably fulfill the limitations of their job extremely well, but they don't really live independently. Those are the people, I think, that suffer when they retire because there's nothing to think about when they become senior citizens. And there's the people also that call themselves senior citizens instead of facing the facts and admitting that they're old.
One of those lovely euphemisms. What humorists have influenced you, or do you find that you have been influenced, which is possible?
I don't really think I've been influenced consciously. That's up to other people to say, but I don't really think I've been influenced consciously. I would say that even though I write in English, and sometimes now in French, timidly, I would say that what I do write has a very Russian savor to it, and that's something I can't avoid. And I would put it down to the fact that the Russian tradition and the tradition of the New World as well are the only two important literary traditions which never, from their inception, admitted a difference between tragedy and comedy, but were always based on observation of the human animal. They had no sense of what's classical and what isn't.
What people do you go to see when you want to laugh?
Well, I can laugh at people. Of course, the funniest people of all are people with no sense of humor. And I can sit in the hall of a hotel and listen to a conversation which is extremely earnest, or rather overhear, I wouldn't say listen, but overhear one, which is irresistibly funny and is much funnier by its implications than anything that a comedian can put across.
Well, what I was trying to say is, do you have favourite comedians?
Well, yes, I have favorite comedians, I suppose. I can't really think. I think Bob Newhart, for instance, is very, very, very funny and goes much further than people think because it's organized. There are so many modern comedians now who are marvelous one evening and erratic the next and sick the next. And if you go and see them, you are always worried as to whether it's a good night or not. And with Bob Newhart, you really don't have to worry. But again, if you put people under that like that under too much pressure, as they tend to do in the world of commercial television and radio, because they're given a certain amount of autonomy, and they have to fulfill a certain routine, then you're liable to find a falling off in the standard that they set themselves. But I think that Newhart's records are classics of folly and stupidity, and they're marvelously observed. And as I say, they go much further to me than some of the social criticisms of people who are taking swipes at society as such, because you can take a far more profound swipe at taking the mickey out of an individual imbecile than you can out of railing at great cross sections at a time.
You married a French-Canadian woman. Do you have an image of the French-Canadian?
Oh yes, I have a very distinct image of French-Canadian. And I think, of course, it's a very moving and individual part of the world, this, since it is an uneasy, at times, marriage between two people that have made their mark in history with almost equal aplomb. I would say overall that in different spheres it's very difficult to calculate. But the French have contributed more, and in some spheres the English have contributed more, but on the whole it's a unique situation, because in other countries you find very often when there are two communities living side by side that one has developed quicker than the other, whereas here you find a reflection of what's really going on in Europe as well, which is that England is being forced to integrate into Europe, which it hates doing. You can't put an outboard motor on England and steer it somewhere else. It is bound to come to terms with France. It has to, for both their sakes, and they're far too old enemies not to treat each other with the greatest possible courtesy now, when new enmities have been found. So I, as an outsider, find that the French-Canadian, it's not really a struggle, but their insistence on identity is perfectly justified. But again, it's mollified, of course, by the intake of so many new Canadians who are neither French nor English, which I think will gradually add another element and give a very palpable personality to this country, which it's obviously trying very hard to find next door to such a huge neighbour.
I've yet to meet an English-speaking person who could do a good imitation of a French-Canadian accent. Can you yet?
No, I can't without making it sound patronising, which I would hate to do, because I find it probably closer to the French that was spoken in France 200 years ago than the French that's spoken today, just as I find that the English accent here is probably closer to what Shakespeare spoke than the abominable accent of the Foreign Office and the hesitations which crept in now, as it were.
Can you do an English Canadian accent as different from your American accents?
No, not really, except that they say it's about 5 o'clock. About, which I've noticed. I can always tell it on that, but otherwise there seems to be a slightly glutinous quality, a slightly measured tone about them that is different from the Americans.
I have to let you go now, I'm afraid, Mr. Ustinov, but thank you very much for
Merci,
speaking with us.
c'était très agréable.